Good evening everyone, my name is John Fitzgerald and I am a current resident at Burgmann College. Welcome to the annual EH Burgmann Lecture. I would first like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and Ngambri people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet this evening, and would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. We are joined this evening by some distinguished guests, including our guest speaker, Mr Hugh Mackay, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor University Experience, Professor Richard Baker, several members of the Burgmann College Council and its chairman, Mr Greg Mills, the Principal of Burgmann College, Miss Sally Renouf, Mr William Brooks and Miss Natalie Atler from Northrop Grumman, and our Burgmann College staff. Welcome also to current and former residents and friends joining us from around the world via the live streaming service. This is a recorded event. Thanks go to Aidan Maxson for his IT support and all the other behind-the-scenes action that went into this evening. Thank you also to our sponsor Chartwells who have supported this event. We are honoured to welcome Mr Hugh Mackay as our guest speaker today. He argues that social fragmentation is the greatest challenge our society now faces, and suggests that we can rebuild trust and cohesion in our local communities by making a renewed commitment to the exercise of kindness, respect and compassion. As we hold these qualities in high regard at Burgmann, it is fitting that we should hear from him today. Hugh Mackay is a social researcher and best-selling author. His research career has spanned 6 decades, including 25 years as research director of the Mackay Report. He is a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and has been awarded honorary doctorates by 5 Australian universities. In 2015, he was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia. Hugh has sat on several boards and is currently a patron of the Asylum Seekers Centre. We are very much looking forward to hearing from you this evening. We will open the floor for questions at the end before some light refreshments. Please join me in welcoming Hugh.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everybody. I'm hoping, or I was expecting, that most of the audience would be students, and there are a fair sprinkling of students, but some, if they are students, are certainly mature age. But what I have to say is relevant to everybody, but particularly tailored to current residents of Burgmann. And of course, it is a very great honour to be invited to deliver this year's Burgmann Lecture at Burgmann College, named for an Anglican bishop whose lively social conscience and provocative political commentary led the Prime Minister of the day, Robert Menzies, to describe him as a most meddlesome priest. Well, to the students, may I say, I hope many of you aspire to be meddlesome in precisely the same way that Bishop Burgmann was, alive to the presence of social ills, sensitive to the needs of the disadvantaged and the marginalised, determined to fight for greater social equality of opportunity. We've never needed voices like that more than we do today. Just consider a few rather challenging facts about contemporary Australia, and then perhaps ponder what Bishop Burgmann might have said or done about these things. We're living with greater income inequality than ever before, and with more rich and more poor people than ever before, and with a shrinking middle class. 2 million of us are currently living in poverty. UNICEF reported last year that 16% of Australian kids under the age of 15 lack regular and reliable access to safe and nutritious food. I might just pause for a moment to let that sink in. 16% in 2018, 16% of dependent kids in Australia lack regular access to safe and nutritious food. We have 2 million Australians currently unemployed or underemployed. Our unemployment statistics, of course, are notoriously misleading. If you have just 1 hour of paid work per fortnight, you count as employed, even though you might wish for many more hours than that. But if you put the unemployed and the underemployed together, that comes to 2 million. We're living in 2018 with our highest and presumably unsustainable level of household and government debt. In the only global survey that's measured this, Australia turned out to have the highest rate of sexual assault in the world. We have in Australia a distorted housing market, a very peculiarly distorted housing market, deliberately distorted to favour investors, with the inevitable consequence that life gets very hard, particularly for young families trying to buy into the housing market. At the same time, tonight, there are at least 100,000 Australians who are homeless, and yet on census night in 2016, 1 million Australian homes, that's 11% of our total housing stock, 1 million Australian homes stood empty. We've not only become a nation of spare rooms, you'll notice as our households have been shrinking, our houses have been getting bigger, but we're a nation of spare houses as well. And while it's true that we have record numbers of Australians now, like many of you, attending university, and some of those universities like this one, absolutely world-class institutions, our school education standards are steadily falling. In a global survey of the 40 top nations in terms of affluence, 40 most affluent societies on the planet, Australia came 39th out of 40 for our literacy and numeracy standards in primary and secondary education. The gap between our best and worst performing schools is now wider than it's ever been. And that's at least partly, if not primarily, because every year we've chosen to give $12 billion of public money to schools which are designed to compete with the public system. And so we've seen the decline in public school performance, bringing our overall school education standards down. We're overweight. We've always liked to think of America being up there, haven't we, as the fattest nation on earth? Well, watch out, America, here we come. We are about to become the fattest nation on earth. 60% of us are overweight. More than 30% of us are obese. According to the Adelaide Sleep Research Institute, we are a sleep-deprived society. I won't ask any of the students present whether they sleep with their smartphone under their pillow. I asked some Year 11 students that recently, and every hand in the room went up. No wonder we're sleep-deprived. We're politically disillusioned. 75% of contemporary Australians say they are disillusioned with federal politics. Only 39% of Australians now say that we have the best system of government that you could have. I suppose one of the signs of the things that we're disillusioned about is the fact that we keep replacing prime ministers at unsustainable rates. I'm told, in fact, that paramedics can no longer ask the question, who is the Prime Minister? They're trying to test people for their cognitive capacity after a knock on the head. And not only politics, but we've lost respect for many of the institutions that were once highly regarded in our society. The churches, the banks. Well, there are churches and banks been the subject of recent royal commissions and damning royal commissions in both cases. Big business, the Edelman Research Organisation that does annual global surveys of attitudes to big business reported last year a worldwide drop in respect for big business, and the drop was greatest in Australia. Trade unions, the mass media, professional sport, even some universities are attracting less public esteem and respect than they once did. Well, what do you think Bishop Burgmann would make of all this? Perhaps you think I'm being too negative. That was a pretty gloomy list that I read you. And of course, you can go to the other side of the ledger and say, oh, if you want to brag, there are things we can say about ourselves that cause us to puff our chest out. Yes, we are undoubtedly world champions at multiculturalism. We've done better than any nation on earth at bringing people from almost 200 different birthplaces around the world and creating an extraordinarily harmonious society. So harmonious that if there are outbreaks of racial tension, racial prejudice or ethnic tension, you hear about it. It makes the media, because that's not the typical Australian behaviour. While we're bragging, we can say we're famously innovative. We are, after all, the inventors of zinc cream, but also rotary lawnmowers, photocopiers, the stump jump plough. What about our Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme? What about our famous census? It's a world-class institution, our census, in spite of the wobbles in 2016. It's the gold standard, really. What about our system of public libraries, a national treasure? What about our social welfare system, which is better than most countries, not as good as some, but better than. And what about federation itself? That's a little miracle that we probably couldn't pull off if we tried to do it today, but it still stays on. And of course, we love to brag about the fact that we win our share, or perhaps more than our share, of Oscars and Nobel Prizes and Olympic gold medals and so on. But I'm not here to draw up a ledger of how we're terrific and how we're not. If, like Bishop Burgmann himself, you are a true patriot, and I would describe myself as a true patriot, we ought to be able to take a clear-eyed look at our society and reflect on what needs fixing. And were Bishop Burgmann with us tonight, and knowing his passion for social justice, I think he might agree with me that the two most significant facts against that whole background that I've sketched in, the two most significant facts about contemporary Australia are these. First, we are a society experiencing a mental health crisis. We have specifically an epidemic of anxiety. Beyond Blue tells us that last year more than 2 million Australians suffered diagnosable anxiety disorders. If you add depression and other forms of mental illness to the anxiety epidemic, you're talking about somewhere between 4 and 5 million Australians last year suffering some form of mental illness. That's fact number one. Fact number two, we are a more socially fragmented society than at any previous time in our history. Now that's a big call, more socially fragmented than ever, but I think I could ask any of you just to stand up and tell us why we're more socially fragmented. We all know why we've become more socially fragmented. We all recognise the symptoms, and by the way, these are not things that have been done to us. These are things that we have chosen to do ourselves. No one said, thou shalt become more socially fragmented, so deal with it. We have changed our way of life voluntarily, in most cases, in ways that have resulted in a greater degree of social fragmentation. Let me just list a few of the obvious factors that have contributed to this. We're living in smaller households than ever before. As I said a moment ago, bigger houses, but smaller households. The average Australian household now is 2.5 people. The fastest growing household type is the single person household, already accounting for 1 household in 4 and heading rapidly to be 1 household in 3. Just ponder that, a society in which every 3rd or 4th household contains just 1 person. That doesn't mean that every 3rd or 4th household contains a lonely person or a person who is socially isolated. It many people who live alone love living alone, see it as a symbol of freedom and independence. They can get out and socialise when they want to, and they can go home and shut the door and punch the air and say, isn't this fantastic? I can whistle out of tune and I can watch daytime television and no one's going to criticise me. But when you have as many households as that, containing just one person, obviously the risk of increased loneliness, the risk of increased social isolation is greatly increased. The UK government has recently appointed a Minister for Loneliness, reflecting exactly the same problem in the UK. Another factor, that between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages are ending in divorce. Now that's obviously hugely disruptive for the couples who are divorcing, but also of course for their families, their extended families, their friendship circles, and the communities that they're moving in and out of. It's also of course feeding the rise of the single person household as a two-person household becomes, at least for a while, two single person households. And if there are kids involved, of course, the social disruption and dislocation is increased. We now have in Australia 1 million dependent kids living with just one of their natural parents. And half of those kids, 500,000, are migrating regularly, once a week or once a fortnight, from the home of the custodial parent to the home of the non-custodial parent for an access visit. There's an example of social disruption on a large scale. I might also say, just while we're running through this list, that I think the falling birth rate should be added to the factors that are increasing social fragmentation. Any of you who are parents know that if you move into a new neighbourhood, it's generally the kids who get to know the other kids first, and gradually social networks develop between the families, courtesy of kids acting as a sort of social lubricant. Well, our birth rate now is the lowest it's ever been. We're down to 1.7 babies per woman and probably falling. The rising generation of young adults represented by the Burgmann students present will probably be, they'll marry less than any generation previously in our history, and they'll probably, more of them will have no kids than any generation in our history. If you're a grandparent hankering after if you're the parent of offspring who are moving now into their 30s or even 40s and still childless, and you're hankering after grandchildren, back off, because there will be more frustrated potential grandparents than ever before in our history. So when the birth rate falls, that social lubricant provided by kids in local communities is in shorter supply. We do compensate, of course. You've noticed how we compensate. As the birth rate has fallen, the rate of pet ownership has risen, and we know that many of those pets are procured as child substitutes. We know that because of the names they're given. Have you noticed we're now giving dogs in particular human names? I recently met a dog called Ian. I don't know why I thought that was amusing, but I see usually it's amusing. I mean, I know a Harry, and that seems all right. I know a Wendy and a Fiona, that's a bit borderline, but Ian seems to be going a bit far. And then, of course, when you go to the dog park, you can't remember whether Ian is the dog or the owner. A couple of other things to justify the statement that we're becoming more socially fragmented. We're becoming more mobile, and not just in the obvious sense that we go everywhere by car. Someone said to me recently, we've become a Dido society, drive in, drive out. And in most of our suburbs, that is how we live. We come and go by car. You wave to your neighbour's car, and you assume your neighbour is driving. That's not quite the same thing as stopping and saying good day on the footpath. But we're also becoming more mobile in the sense that we're moving house more often than ever before. In fact, we're moving house on average once every 6 years, exactly the same as the US rate. We're also busier than we've ever been. Have you noticed how we've now elevated busyness to the status of a virtue. You dare not admit that you're not busy. If any of you are retired, you will know that it's de rigueur to say, I'm so busy, I don't know how I ever found time to go to work. We've become upset. It's even changed the way we greet each other. Have you noticed that people say, how are you going? Busy? As though, are you dead or are you busy? It seems to have got out of control. We are working longer hours, exactly the opposite of what was promised when particularly information technology invaded the workplace. But now, of course, people typically complain that they are never away from work because of access to emails and text messages and so on. And then, of course, there's the information technology revolution itself, which is a great paradox. We don't know how this is going to turn out long term because we're still in the thick of it, but it's pretty clear where it's going. It is a great paradox. On the one hand, it promises to make us more closely connected to each other than ever before. On the other hand, it makes it easier than ever before to stay away from each other and to rely on messages that are exchanged without human presence. And for thousands of years, humans have thought that communication required, demanded human presence. But now we've decided that digital impulses on a screen can pass as communication, even though in fact they're data transfer, and all the subtlety, all the nuance of face-to-face contact is lost when we communicate in that way. It's not surprising, perhaps, that the latest research on young people's heavy use of information technology is showing us among teenagers that the heaviest users of social media in particular tend to feel more socially isolated and lonelier than lighter users. So the paradox persists. Well, let me stop that list. I'm sure there are other things you would add to a list if you're trying to explain how we've become more socially fragmented. But just even thinking about the things I've described, and thinking about the cumulative effect of those social changes. What does it do to a society when we're changing in all those ways? Pretty obviously, it puts pressure on the stability and the cohesiveness of local neighbourhoods and communities, and for that reason also tends to diminish our sense of trust in the people we live amongst. Edith Cowan University published some research a few years ago reporting that only 35% of Australians say they trust their neighbours. It's an extraordinarily alarming figure. I hope it doesn't apply to you, and I hope your neighbours aren't saying that. It couldn't be true, could it, that 65% of Australians have untrustworthy neighbours, but it could well be true in this increasingly fragmented and socially isolating way of life that we're developing. It could well be true that 65% of Australians don't know their neighbours well enough to know that they can trust them. Well, more social fragmentation almost inevitably drives rampant individualism. The rise of the so-called me culture coincides with this increasing social fragmentation, strongly reinforced, of course, by the consumer mass marketing industry and by the happiness industry. Both of those, coming from very different points of view, feed the idea that it's all about me, all about my prosperity, my material comfort, and my personal happiness. Well, I said I was going to be talking about two fundamental facts about Australia, a mental health epidemic and the problem of growing social fragmentation. But as I'm sure you've already realised, what I'm really describing here is just one fact. These two things are inextricably linked. They're like two sides of the same coin. Heads, we become more socially fragmented. Tails, we will become a more anxious society. Now, I accept that there are many causes of anxiety in individual cases. People will talk about job insecurity, or exam stress, or rent stress, or relationship breakdowns, or loss of faith, or addiction to IT devices, or loss of contact with the natural world, or even a concern about the future of the planet. All these things can drive individuals' sense of anxiety. But when you're talking about an epidemic on the scale that I've been describing, it seems to me we have to look beyond the individual causes to some kind of societal movement, some kind of change in the nature, the fabric of our society that's led to this. And here's where it seems to me social fragmentation looks like the chief culprit, for the very obvious reason that social fragmentation absolutely denies our true nature as social beings. It's in our DNA to be communitarians. We are a species, like most other species on the planet, who absolutely need to be nurtured, supported, protected by communities. The essence of our nature as human beings is social. It often seems as though the most interesting thing between you and me is the differences between us, and we, particularly in psychology, we spend a lot of time studying individual differences. But in fact, the most significant thing about us is our common humanity. The fact that we share this quality in our DNA. We share this quality of needing each other, needing herds, groups, tribes, colleges to belong to give us a sense of identity. There's a lot of nonsense talked about the sense of identity, the quest for personal identity. People rush off on weekend workshops to find themselves and so on. Save your money. Don't ever go on a weekend workshop to find yourself. You don't find yourself by gazing in the mirror or by gazing at your navel. You discover who you are by gazing into the faces of the people who love you, the people who you live amongst, colleagues, fellow inmates of Burgmann College. This is who you are. You can't define your identity without a social context. And so when we become more socially fragmented, even our sense of ourselves as individuals is eroded to some extent. When humans feel cut off from the herd, because we're herd animals, when we feel cut off from the herd, anxiety is the almost inevitable consequence, which is why in our criminal justice system, solitary confinement is the worst punishment we can think of to inflict on someone. So the epidemic of anxiety is really a symptom of the problem of social fragmentation. Social fragmentation leads to an increased risk of social isolation, loneliness, feelings of social exclusion, and even a sense of alienation. Psychologists and medical practitioners around the Western world, where this is a widespread phenomenon that I've been describing, are coming to think that social isolation is now a major health hazard. In fact, a prominent American psychologist at last year's meeting of the American Psychological Association said social isolation is a greater threat to public health than obesity. We know what sort of threat to public health obesity is. They're saying social isolation is a greater threat. Now, all this stuff is interesting. Social analysis captivates me because that's the business I'm in. But it's more than interesting, isn't it? We're not just this is not just some other planet that we're studying. It's not some other society we're analysing. We are not mere bystanders to these phenomena that I've been talking about. These are our communities. These are our neighbourhoods. This is our college. This is our society. Social fragmentation is something we've done. And so the anxiety epidemic that flows from it is something for which it seems to me we can't avoid some responsibility. The tragedy is that we are not living as if our own health, especially our own mental health, depends on the health of the communities that we belong to, and yet it does. So what are we going to do about all this? There's never just one answer to complex problems like the ones I've been describing. But it seems to me if we're interested in addressing the problem of social fragmentation and the twin problem of an anxiety epidemic, the best starting point can be captured in one word, a simple, very old-fashioned word, compassion. For all the reasons I've been discussing, I think almost inevitably we've become a less compassionate society because we've been encouraged to think more of ourselves as individuals than as members of neighbourhoods, communities, etc. We've been encouraged to think of ourselves as consumers, to focus too much on our own wants, our own entitlements, our own gratifications, with less regard for the needs and the well-being of others. And because that denies our destiny as social beings who need to belong to communities, it carries an inevitable threat to our mental health. Now, when I say compassion, let me explain what I mean. I'm not talking about an emotional state. I'm not talking about bleeding hearts. I'm not talking about something that's just the province of saints and do-gooders in the community. I think of compassion as a cool mental discipline. I think of it, in fact, as the only rational response to a real understanding of what it means to be human. Because if you think about what it means to be human, what it means to belong to a human community like this one, you soon realise that the only way a community like this, or a local neighbourhood, or a workplace, or any human community can survive and prosper is if we treat each other as if we are all one. If we treat each other with the kindness and the respect that we would hope to receive from others, recognising that there is a common humanity, recognising that each of us is part of this same species. How else should we consider behaving except kindly and with respect for each other, especially, and this of course is the acid test of compassion, especially people we don't like much, especially people we disagree with profoundly. That's the test of whether we've actually got what it means to be human and what it means to treat others as though they are part of us. Adopting the discipline of compassion has a double effect. It has a personal and a social consequence. The personal effect is that it lowers anxiety. Nothing gets our anxiety level down like a focus on the needs of other people. Nothing steadies the emotions like the knowledge that someone else needs us. There is no better cure for loneliness than a decision to solve someone else's loneliness problem. So there's a social consequence of compassion as well, which is that it acts like a kind of high-octane fuel that drives the machinery of social cohesion and generates social capital, especially in the local neighbourhood. And the more I've looked at Australia's ills and possible solutions to the causes and the possible solutions to them, the more I've come to the conclusion that we need to focus much more on small local communities, whether it's the neighbourhood or a village like Burgmann College. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the best indicator of the health of a nation is the health of its local neighbourhoods and communities. And the reason for that, in the street where you live or in the college where you reside, is that these are places where we didn't choose the people that we were going to live with. And this is the acid test of our moral maturity, of our understanding of what it means to be human, and of our willingness to adopt the discipline of compassion. You move into a street, most people buy or rent a house or apartment and move in because they like it. Very few people interview all the residents of the street or the apartment to see if this would be a congenial place. And even applying to come to somewhere like Burgmann, you can get a sense of what kind of community it's likely to be, but you don't presumably have a chance to interview all the other students who are here to say, do I like them enough to live with them? No, it's just like a neighbourhood. You're plonked down and you suddenly find that you're in the midst of all these weird people who think that you are weird as well, because we're all weird, but these are your neighbours. And the only way for neighbourhoods, colleges, communities of any kind to function is for us to recognise that neighbour is a special category of status for humans. We can be spouses, we can be offspring, we can be siblings, we can be parents. We understand what all of those roles imply, but there is this special role called neighbour, which is the place or the relationship where we have to learn to get along with people who seem often quite unlike us. Now, of course, it can be done. There's a spectacular example of how one neighbourhood did it in the township of Frome in Somerset in the UK. If you want to look this up, by the way, Frome is spelled F-R-O-M-E, but it's pronounced Frome. In 2013, a GP in the township of Frome came to the conclusion that many of her patients who were suffering from anxiety disorders, particularly elderly patients, were also rather socially isolated. They weren't closely connected with the local community. And she began to see that what the link was. She began to see that social isolation was a major health factor. So she got together with some other medical people and with local councillors and other community leaders, and together they launched a project with a rather clunky name, the Compassionate Frome Project. That's what they called it. Now, the research into the effect of the Compassionate Frome Project is now being published, and it's remarkable stuff. In a 3-year period, emergency hospital, all sorts of health indicators improved, but here's the most remarkable of them. Emergency hospital admissions in Frome fell by 17% across the 3 years, while throughout Somerset, emergency hospital admissions rose by 29%. General health improved across most indicators. A local palliative care physician said, no other intervention on record has reduced emergency admissions across a population. Okay, what was this fantastic intervention? What brilliant creative strategy did this GP and her colleagues come up with to form the Compassionate Frome Project? You'd never be able to think of this stuff yourself. It's too out there, it's too brilliant, it's too astonishing. Get to know your neighbours. Always smile and say hello when you pass someone in the street. Don't get into a lift and pretend that you're not members of the same species, or stand at a bus stop. Say hello, discuss the weather, anything. Keep a watchful eye on people in your street who are at risk of social isolation, especially the elderly. Get engaged with community activities. In Frome it was things like choirs and community gardens, book clubs, men's sheds, etc. In Burgmann, of course, there are many activities that members of this community can engage with. Give people the gift of listening. When someone needs to talk to you, even if it's inconvenient, let them talk. Listen. Show them that you take them seriously. Well, it wasn't very remarkable, was it? And yet, that needs to be thought about in the context of an increasingly common phenomenon in our two major cities, Sydney and Melbourne, and increasingly in the other capitals and in some regional cities as well, where it's almost now an urban cliche for people to say, we don't know our neighbours, and for us to hear appalling stories of people who are isolated in their homes, ill and no one knowing that they're ill, dying and no one knowing that they're dying. We all saw in the media last year that appalling story about a couple in Sydney where the wife was blind, the husband was her carer, the husband died, the wife starved to death. Where were the neighbours? That was the question the cops asked when they finally discovered this. Where were the neighbours? Well, the neighbours, when consulted on this, said, well, we're a bit too busy. We didn't notice. Not just too busy to help, too busy even to notice that help was needed. Well, it can be completely different, and in many parts of Australia, including many parts of Canberra, it is gratifyingly very different. But the tendency is moving in the wrong direction. I hope it isn't moving in the wrong direction within Burgmann. I hope it's the case that everybody knows everybody and that you wouldn't dream of being in a room next to someone who you didn't know. I heard someone who lives in Sydney recently who lives in a terrace house. You'd think terrace housing was ideal for encouraging social interaction. This bloke said he goes to bed at night, puts his head on the pillow against the common wall between him and the next house in the terrace, and he has the weird feeling that just on the other side of the wall someone else is putting their head on their pillow and he has no idea who they are. Well, it's easy to complain about the state of the nation. It's easy to look at the list of things that I read out at the beginning of this presentation. It's not so easy to embrace the idea that the state of the nation is actually determined by us. It's not ultimately a political question. It's ultimately about understanding our role as citizens and particularly as neighbours. Understanding that the state of the nation starts right here, whether right here is Burgmann or the street or the apartment block where you live. Each of us in this college and in this university community is helping to shape the culture of this community, and that's how we contribute to the kind of society we will become. Can I conclude by just saying to the students who are present that when you do finally graduate, as you will, and move on from here, some of you are going to do remarkable things, possibly in politics, possibly in science, possibly in medicine or law or commerce or the arts or academia, perhaps in teaching, I hope in teaching. And while all of those contributions will matter and will make an impact on our society, and some of you perhaps will make an impact on the world, and I hope all of you will be meddlesome in the Burgmann sense, let me suggest that all of you can make a significant impact on the kind of society we will become, regardless of what your professional or working life consists of. All of us can make a significant impact on the kind of society we will become by embracing the discipline of compassion and by placing personal relationships at the top of your list of priorities. Already you are someone's son or daughter. Most of you will become someone's partner or spouse. Many of you will become parents. All of you will be neighbours, work colleagues, members of groups and associations, faith communities, etc. May I urge you to treat your time at Burgmann as the test bed, as the training ground for learning the deepest human lesson of all, that is, how to treat others kindly and with respect, especially when you don't like them, and especially when you disagree with them. That's how we build a civil society. That's how we restore social cohesion. That's how we get our anxiety levels down. What a wonderful thing it would be if Burgmann alumni were known above all for their compassion. Thank you. Now we have plenty of time for questions or comments. Doesn't have to be questions. If you just want to make a smart remark or tell us an anecdote, that's fine. So anyone who'd like to say anything, please put up your hand. Yes?
Just a quick question. So, well, perhaps not that quick, but when you spoke a lot about the importance of social cohesion and social engagement for addressing the mental health issues that a lot of people are experiencing. A lot of people who are experiencing mental illness and mental ill health have difficulty engaging with the community and stepping out into those groups. Obviously, that's quite a big medical issue to address, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. That is a huge question, and I'm grateful to you for raising it, because there is in fact a vicious circle in all of this. When, because of social isolation, people do become more anxious or more depressed, that very mental state discourages connection with the community. So the whole thing, it's like a descending spiral. I feel as though I'm not being taken seriously, or I'm not being socially included. I'm becoming anxious about that or more depressed about that. And now, because I'm in that state, I'm much less likely to engage or to feel outgoing or to have the courage to try and connect. Which is why those of us who are not anxious and not depressed, I think, because we're humans, have to shoulder the responsibility of being alert to the people who are at risk of getting caught in this spiral, because it might happen without us knowing, and then we'll never hear from them because they'll shut themselves in their room and keep to themselves and so on. I think part of one of the implications of the discipline of compassion is that we do become alert to people who seem to be at risk. And you know, the question that's now become the cliche question, are you okay, is a great question, because it just opens up the possibility that there's something here we might need to talk about. Thank you for that. Yeah, any other comments or questions?
Over here.
Yes, sorry.
The good people of Frome, how did they become more compassionate? You told us what happened.
Yes.
But did the GP and her colleagues just gently suggest these changes, or
yes.
shame them into it? How did it happen?
No, they didn't shame them into it. No, it was propaganda. I mean, they did take some very specific initiatives. They formed support groups to help people who were struggling with mental issues, compliance with drug prescriptions, etc., and struggling with financial issues. So that was one very particular initiative. If a bank or a financial advisor or a medical practitioner identified someone who needed support, there were these sort of flying task force groups that could go and give them support. But mostly it was just propaganda saying, join a choir, smile and say hello, don't forget to ask, are you okay, etc. So it was public education is the polite word for propaganda. That's all it was. So it was called the Compassionate Frome Project, but they weren't saying, please be more compassionate. They were going straight to the behavioural instruments that would produce this. So join, connect, engage, knowing that if people do that, they do tend to become more compassionate. Yeah.
On that, do you see something at like more of a federal or a state level, like just like policy in general, being able to help that as well? Like, so like a Compassionate Australia project at a federal level, like what would that look like?
Yes. I doubt very much whether it could be a federal initiative. Even the UK appointing a Minister for Loneliness strikes me as a bit odd. I don't think we need a Minister for Loneliness. I think we all need to appoint ourselves as ambassadors for social cohesion or social inclusion. But I do think there is a role for government, particularly local government. I do think at the level of local communities, or in Canberra's case, the ACT government, there is certainly an opportunity for initiatives that encourage more, to get plenty of stories out about the positive effects on people of engaging and participating and so on. And local community groups in a city like Canberra, It's often regions, the inner south, the inner north, Belconnen, etc., who can take these initiatives at the local level. In my new book about all this, I quote a particular Canberra initiative which has been taken in Narrabundah by a woman who started one group, but it's soon going to proliferate into a series of groups called WAGs, Women Across Generations. And these are women-only groups, but they are designed to bring together people from very different generations in the same community, just to talk about anything. And I was invited to go to one of these, and it was a remarkable experience. They spent an enormous amount of time attacking men. I was sitting sort of hidden in the corner. I've often had that experience in my research career. But there was no sort of morning tea or ending with a drink or anything. They were just there to have a conversation. Now, the effect of that, of course, is these women are getting to know each other and to feel as if they belong in a community where they were previously feeling more socially isolated. People do it with picnics in the park. All sorts of initiatives can be taken. But yeah, I think local government can encourage it. And of course, looking at it on a larger scale, local government can encourage it by urban design. I mean, brilliant urban planning facilitates incidental contact among members of a particular neighbourhood or community. High-rise apartments, for example, are antithetical to social interaction because the more tightly we pack humans into a space, the higher we go. Parramatta are now talking about having a series of 100-floor towers. Well, the more tightly, the denser the living arrangement, the more people get obsessed with privacy, security, and avoiding eye contact in the lift and so on. Medium density is a great way to go, even better than the strung out so-called over block, which is a bit socially isolating as well. So there are some very imaginative urban planners who are starting to talk about how, even with maybe not ultra high rise, but some high rise like we're having around Canberra, we can do things at street level that will encourage more spontaneous social interaction. The key to a functioning neighbourhood is that you don't have to make an appointment to see your neighbours. The key to a functioning neighbourhood is that we run into each other, and so we need more spaces that encourage that. Regional shopping malls are not the best answer. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Sorry, I agree with all your comments about
Except
having a role. In my experience working in local government in regional areas in New South Wales and other jurisdictions in Australia, I've found that all those things, that definitely the opportunity to do that, but there are special interests that get in the way, and it's actually in their interest to divide communities as opposed to making them socially cohesive.
yes.
So how do we show compassion to these kinds of people? I know I've been in medicine, I've got people here that can back me up, but just to know about it,
Yes.
end up washed up and anxious.
Yes, yes. Well, you can show compassion. I mean, this is what I meant when I said this is the acid test. There is no doubt that you're much more likely to persuade people gradually to accept your point of view if you treat them kindly and with respect. Not acquiescing, not agreeing with what they say, making it clear that you don't agree with what they say, but doing it in a spirit of we're all humans, we're all in this thing together, we all want the same thing, namely a peaceful, harmonious, thriving community. We have different opinions about how to get there, but let's keep talking. And I think keeping the talking, not saying, well, we better just agree to disagree and storm off, that's the end of negotiation, that's the end of the possibility of any sort of conversion of that person to your point of view. It's a slow, painstaking process, but if you actually do have a goal, it's certainly worth the investment of saying, I can't stand this person, I think their motives are all wrong, there's nothing about their values that I admire, but we're in this together. And if I show kindness towards them and respect towards them, there is much more likelihood that they will show the same towards me. I think the most fundamental of all the social determinants of human behaviour is the desire to be taken seriously. And people are at their worst when we don't take them seriously. So even if we don't like them, even if we don't trust them, even if we don't agree with their point of view, if we can take them seriously, that's going to be therapeutic for them, and it's going to increase the probability that the channels between us will remain open. Watch what happens when we appear not to... I mean, not listening to someone is a sign that we are not taking them seriously. And the effect of that on the person concerned. I mean, if you're talking to someone, you want them to be listening and it's obvious they're looking at their watch or looking over your shoulder in the hope of catching sight of someone more interesting to talk to, the first thing you think is, they don't take me seriously. I'm not worth the investment of their time in just listening to what I'm saying. So it's not a hard concept to grasp, but it is, of course, a difficult principle to adopt.
I encourage you to run for elected office. Respect you for sure, don't worry.
It's never crossed my mind. Yes.
Australia now has several 100,000 overseas students, mainly in universities and other tertiary institutions. These people seem to be particularly prone to isolation. Have you seen any particular initiatives that you think help that particular class of people in our society?
I can't say that I have. The problem you identify, absolutely right. And whether they're students or refugees or immigrants. I mean, we often mutter and grumble about how people from particular ethnic groups tend to congregate in a particular suburb or area, at least for a generation or two. In other words, they do exactly what we would do if we were in an alien culture. But of course, a lot of that happens because they don't feel as though we really are welcoming, we really want them to be here. They might feel as though we are tolerating them, that terrible word, as opposed to embracing them or being curious about them. But maybe Burgmann or maybe someone else from ANU has something to say about what ANU does to ensure that that problem doesn't occur, because it is a huge problem. And it's easy to imagine the problem, because we only have to imagine ourselves going to study in a Chinese university and seeing how we would feel in a completely strange cultural setting. Does anyone want to comment on initiatives that we know of that have been taken?
I'm happy to speak to Burgmann just on a small individual scale. So we had a couple of international students from China who didn't feel particularly connected in our village, and so they just came over to my place and we made lemon meringue pies because one knew how to cook and one didn't, and so it was an opportunity to chat. On a larger scale, we are hosting our college's first Eid al-Adha at the Festival of Sacrifice for Muslim residents, and also open to all residents. So we do celebrate Christmas in July, but we also have a number of Muslim residents, particularly in our village, so we're all interested to celebrate that and share that with people. It's just a couple of tiny examples.
And
Yes, thanks, Alan.
our student associations have very active international student division. So they had their welcome for commencing students last Friday. There was 400 or 500 students from all around the world there. And also we have very active national groups. Increasingly they are a combination of international students and domestic students with heritage from those countries. So my job as the Pro-Vice Chancellor, I go to all those events, and I made a mistake earlier this year asking people at the Vietnamese desk which part of Vietnam they came from. I can speak a little bit of Vietnamese, so I go try to show off, and they said they're from Cabramatta and Sydney. And that to me is a really good sign of our students. And some particular nationalities are very good at building bridges. So I've taught here for over 20 years, and Singaporean students in particular are often literally translating between Cantonese, Mandarin and English. So I think one of the roles the university has to do is work with our student groups and assist them and empower them to try to make a difference here.
Yes, thank you. Well,
We divide the world into developed nations, developing nations, and this peculiar term emerging. I've never understood quite what that means. As I understand it, the data suggests that that mental health is a bigger issue in developed nations than it is in developing nations. Now, it may be that that's a diagnosis issue, but I suspect not. So it does seem to be something to do with this idea of development that produces mental health. Now that's very, very hard. Just it's an oxymoron, isn't it? I mean, how could we be developed if we're more mentally less healthy?
yes.
So I wonder if you've got any reflections on that. I mean, what characterises a developed nation is the marketisation of so much of our interaction.
Yeah.
You suggest that we can fix that, this as individuals, but for most of my life I've been fighting against, I guess this overall sort of marketisation idea, and I'm a bit doubtful that we can do it as individuals, that maybe we do have to do something about the way we are running our society.
Yeah. Oh, look, I agree. Well, first of all, your analysis is completely correct. This is a Western disease. The problem of social fragmentation and the associated epidemics of anxiety and depression are a phenomenon of most Western countries. Not all, but most. So we could talk about this in the Australian context and say exactly the same in the US, Canada, the UK, Germany, France, etc. So it's a Western phenomenon, and I agree with you that it's happened because of a particular stage we've reached in our, I suppose, socio-economic evolution. You describe it as marketisation. Others might talk about neoliberalism, etc. We've got to the stage where, in the lifetime of some of the people in this room, we've moved from being a more communitarian society to being what we are now, more fragmented and more marketised. So it's not as though this was something that's always been with us in the West. It is associated with a particular economic philosophy, economic and political philosophy, particularly of the last 50 years. And that's when we've seen, when many people will now say we no longer feel as if we're living in a society, we feel as if we're living in an economy. Everything is always about the bottom line. Everything is always about the economic factors. We're not hearing people talking about their vision in Australia, but in other countries also, talking about their vision for the kind of society we want to become. This is what sort of society we'd like to be. Well, in order to do it, there are some economic moves we have to make. We only hear about the economic moves without hearing anything about the associated vision, if there is one. So we suspect there isn't one. So I agree with you absolutely that we are heading for, I think inevitably we are heading for a revolution on quite a large scale about the global economy as well as the Australian economy. And you know, people like you and others can agitate and we can all vote and express our views, etc. But it's not either or. I mean, we can do all that and analyse all that and dream of it, but at the same time there's someone next door who needs us to say good day. So I'm not naive enough to say if we all make our neighbourhoods thrive, that'll solve the problems of neoliberal economics. But I am naive enough or idealistic enough to say we could start to build a momentum in favour of a more communitarian spirit by making it happen in this street, this college, this suburb. Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yes.
That question has actually made me think. I'd love to know your thoughts of what we can learn from our Indigenous cultures, our Indigenous people around us, because I think that makes me think, you know, we're such an individualist society. Is there anything?
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
Well, culturally, there's no doubt that. In fact, I was giving a talk some years ago about social motivations, desires, and I mentioned this. In my mind, the preeminence of the desire to be taken seriously, and an Indigenous person said, "Not in our culture, because that's too individualistic for us. You know, we don't expect to be taken seriously as individuals. We belong, and what one knows, we all know. You know, it's shared. People who visited Aboriginal communities, lived in Aboriginal communities, which I never have, say it's extraordinary. I don't know how they, you know, I tell someone something and then everyone seems to know what I've told them. How did that get around? I didn't hear them saying it. I mean, the idea that information would be held as opposed to be shared doesn't exist in that culture in its what I describe as its purest form, where there is actually a functioning Indigenous community. So I think we do have a lot to learn, and of course not just Australian Indigenous communities that can teach us that. We can learn that from lots of other cultures in Asia and Africa. The famous old African proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child," that's true. That's literally true. If you want a healthy child, you won't do it all by yourself. The nuclear family is a very unhealthy environment for raising kids. We do need neighbours. We do need communities. We do need school, social communities, faith communities, etc. And not only for kids. You know, it seems to me it's not just it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to keep us all sane. Yes, yes.
You touched on a big theme through this about how a lot of the social fragmentation and anxiety, as you put it, hitting Australia is due to a loss of community. Do you think part of that can be attributed to the loss of the church being the touchstone or cornerstone of community within a broader sense? I keep using the word community, but that's the best one for it. And if so, do you think there's anything coming up that will potentially replace it, or do you think we're in for a massive shock to how our thousands-of-year-old system has run?
Well, I think we are in for some massive shocks. But the role of religion, I couldn't hear exactly, you were saying the role of churches, did you say?
Yeah.
Yes. The role of churches in this whole story is very significant because there is, and there's some very interesting research now available which shows that people who have religious faith and regularly engage in religious practice are generally healthier than people who don't have that. They have lower rates of depression, lower rates of anxiety, quicker bounce back from depression, etc., in terms of mental health. Now, I don't think that should lead people to say, I'd better go to church to get my blood pressure down, or, and by the way, you can get many of the same benefits from pet ownership as you can from religious practice. So let's keep this in perspective. However, it is a very interesting situation, because what a lot of that research suggests is that this is to do with people having placed their faith in something greater than themselves, which Martin Seligman, the high priest of the positive psychology movement, says, and has been saying for 30 years, the one prerequisite for people to have a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives is that they should have placed their faith in something greater than themselves. Now, he's not advocating religion, but of course, as you say, for thousands of years it has been a religious framework that's provided people with the something greater than the self. For some people it's the nation, for some people it's the family, for some people it's an idea, you know, justice or social equality or whatever it might be. But the research on the health benefits of religion often overlook the communal benefits. So a lot of what that's about is not just the faith in something greater than ourselves, but also the fact that we are members of a mutually supportive, mutually respectful community. And many people, I did some research for a previous book called Beyond Belief. Many of the people that I spoke to who are regular churchgoers said, I don't want the other people that I'm in church with to know exactly what I believe, because I don't think it's what they believe, but it's such a great community and some of my best friends are there, I would never leave, even though I've lost the faith that I used to have, I've got some other kind of faith, etc. So there are two challenges for the sort of society that Robin was describing a moment ago that's become so, what was your word? Marketised. So it's become so marketised and individualised, where we really have, we are in the grip of a rampant individualism. Now that is antithetical to the messages of all religions. And it's antithetical to the idea that there's something greater than me that I could put my faith in, and it's antithetical to the idea that I need a community to connect with. So the challenge in a society like ours, only 15% of Australians attend church once a month or more often. It's only 8% who are weekly attenders. Though when it comes to church-based colleges or schools, faith-based schools, enrolment's going through the roof. So there's a lot of parents who want their kids to go to a religious school but who don't want to have any truck with religion themselves. That's another subject. But if we're in a situation of declining religious faith and practice, the great challenge for this more marketised, more individualised society is, what will we put our faith in? And what will we encourage our kids to put their faith in? And where will we connect? What will be the alternative to the faith community, which is a unique kind of community? I mean, there aren't other communities quite like that, where you get a spine-stiffening homily once a week, and subjects like compassion are talked about quite openly. It doesn't often happen in our Western societies. So we will either return to those churches, and that seems very unlikely, or we'll look for some alternative way of satisfying those two very profound needs. Yes.
To what extent do you think platforms like Facebook contribute to this issue, and do those companies have a role to play in your solution?
Yes, thanks for that. Yeah, it's the paradox that I mentioned briefly in my presentation. Facebook, still the biggest of the social media platforms, although people are deserting Facebook, particularly in Europe. Young adults are deserting Facebook in droves, not for the reasons that we might think of, like the insecurity of data, but the fact that their parents go on Facebook. And so do little kids. So if you're a cool adolescent or a 20-something, you don't really want to be on the same social media platform as your parents, especially if they're going to be looking in, seeing what you're up to. In fact, some parents say, well, that's the only way I can know what my kids are doing. I get on Facebook. I never post anything. I don't let them know I'm there. But that's how it. So, but the. I mean, and Facebook is fantastic for example, far-flung extended families keeping in touch with each other. There are lots of lovely things that happen on Facebook and social media generally, but we do have to, there are two things we have to understand about Facebook. It is fundamentally a surveillance medium. It's there to watch us and record our every thought and action to sell to people who would like to know that about us so they can advertise to us. So it's a surveillance medium. And it's a medium that tends to erode the sense of social connectedness, which is the great irony of it. But it's not so ironic, I suppose, when you think about what's happening. The more time we spend with the screen, the less time we have for each other. And the more time we spend with the screen, the more we come to think that we need that constant source of stimulation, and a conversation with the old lady next door is a bit slow moving. and a bit dull compared with all the stuff I can access on Facebook or on the internet otherwise. I think there's a correction coming. I mean, I know I am a bit naive and a bit blinded by my own optimism when I try to analyse this stuff, but I think there is a correction coming because this does contradict our fundamental nature as humans who need to be present to each other and empathic in our connections. So when you go on Facebook or any other, not specifically Facebook, but sort of the other half of your question, do they have some responsibility? I think they only have a responsibility to declare what they're up to. You know, we are free to choose whether to sign up for a surveillance medium that's there to exploit us or not. And we do a trade-off, and millions of people around the world say it's worth it. I don't mind being surveyed if I can get these other benefits. But humans ultimately can only communicate when they're together. We only make ourselves vulnerable to each other, which is the essence of human communication, when we are present to each other. Eye contact, touching each other, that sort of kiss on the cheek, touch on the arm, those sort of things are like a sort of super highway to the brain. Empathic gestures are far more potent in human interaction than the words we exchange with each other. So we're giving up a lot of that at the moment. We're falling for the idea that you can have a rich experience of community in an online community. Now, online communities are great, and they have all sorts of advantages for all sorts of people, especially people who are a bit socially isolated, but they lack the absolutely essential ingredient of a human community, which is we are present to each other, vulnerable to each other, all that stuff. People are, why are people so nasty on Facebook? Answer, because they're not present. You know, it's this, you can shout abuse at a fellow motorist as long as you got your window up. Sort of stuff you'd never say face to face. Yes, are we through? Yes.
Thank you, Hugh. I have a vision for Canberra, and it's the same sort of vision that you've been outlining. We're a small city. We've got a beautiful environment. We're a new city. We've got a lot of the attributes you'd think, well, surely here we could connect with each other. Surely here we could do what it will take to create those changes. But where would you start? What would you do to
well, this closely links to the earlier question. Well, I'd start small. I'd start local. I wouldn't. I don't think I'd say to the Chief Minister, "Quick, launch the Compassionate Canberra project." But I might say to a local community organisation in the general area and there are a lot of these community organisations that, you know, put 3 or 4 suburbs together into a sort of social, thinking of them as a social unit, to encourage initiatives within those local community organisations that do encourage greater participation, a greater sense of the locality as a neighbourhood, and encourage, and just as they did in Frome, encourage people to engage, join a choir, you know, start a community garden, start a book club, always go to the local coffee shop, be there. It's even a good reason for going to church. You know, meet people in the local community and be seen, be engaged. And this is one of those things where it really is win-win. I hate that expression, but this is a real win-win, because for the individual, it's life-enhancing, it's good for our mental health, but also, of course, it means we are now increasing our own awareness of the needs in that community. Until you are connected with your neighbourhood, you don't know that the woman 3 doors down is very frail and would actually appreciate someone putting her bin out or doing a bit of shopping for her. We've got to get connected to know these things. So that's what I would suggest. By the way, when I've only been living in Canberra for 18 months, Haven't yet found anything wrong with the place, which is, I realise, it can't last. They do drive through stop signs, that's terrible. You can't rely on them stopping. Sorry, I've lost I'm obsessed with stop signs. Oh yes, when I was saying to friends I'm moving to Canberra, it's such an unfriendly place, all these sort of cliques, you're going to find it terribly hard to break in. Well, I go walking every day and everybody says hello. I can't fault the footpaths of Canberra so far. Shopkeepers, people, it seems to me it does have already the core of what you're dreaming of here. We just need to take it to the next level. Yeah. Yes, please.
It's interesting that I keep hearing that we want institutions to fix things.
Yes.
We've become a really institutionalized society.
Yeah.
And I was single, I've never married, I've moved a great deal for my career. And so I didn't have kids to break into neighborhoods. But what I uncovered early on is it's grassroots people starting a group.
Yes.
I mean, there was a time in my career when we were breaking through into upper management, and it was really tough for the women. We were very isolated. And we found each other, so
yes.
We just had this group. We met once a month. We hashed out problems of how you deal with some of the misogyny and things. And we all became great friends, and we had a place to go.
Yes.
And there's a place outside Canberra called Wamboy. And people who live in Wamboy live on 5 to 40 acres, generally. And so it's isolated. And what's happened as people have aged, full of retired people, retired military, is somebody started a social group on Thursdays. Come play. We'll have a ping pong table, we'll do this, we'll have a poker club. And I talked to somebody about it the other day. I don't go to it because I do a different activity on Thursdays. Who said, my God, now the young women with little babies are coming so they can meet people.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the solution isn't an institution going to change it.
Yeah.
It's grassroots groups who say, I see a need, let's get some people together.
Yeah.
And I've been part of several of those. And then you reach out to people and say, you don't need to be alone, come on.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's a beautiful case study, really, of the very things we're talking about. Yes, the answer is not institutional. It's not up to the government or the church or, employers or anything to transform this. It is grassroots. And in fact, I think, curiously, at a time when people are so disillusioned about politics and when the leaders of both the major parties are held in such low esteem, and when so many institutions are on the nose, this is actually not a bad thing, short term, for encouraging the idea that we better do it ourselves. There isn't a magic wand, there isn't an institutional solution, so let's put a ping pong table in the garage and see who comes. There's a lovely American movement that I only recently heard about called the turquoise table movement. This is people all over America who are painting a table turquoise and putting it in their front yard and sitting in the front yard to have a cup of coffee, not in the backyard, so people who are walking past might come and sit at the turquoise table and join them, like the little library movement. People who are putting a little box or an old broken down fridge or something in their front garden full of books they don't want. People are coming by, taking books, bringing books. It soon becomes a group thing. And your emphasis on the group, as we heard in relation to foreign students, for example, it's the group, it's the sense that there's a little herd here that you could connect with. It's much more effective when it's a group than when it's just one-to-one. Yes, Les.
Hugh, you mentioned about putting out somebody's bin. I thought I should just share with you that in our street in Canberra, we don't have to tell people we're away, we just leave our bin out. right? So if it's out there for 2 nights, obviously the bones are away. Somebody will put the bin away, and they know we're back when the bin's out again. Which is interesting because there was one thing that did come up in our street, and you may have had this experience and know a lot more than I, but I thought that we should do our disaster plan, you know, fire thing.
Yes.
And I looked and I think page 1 said, give the details of all your neighbours. Oh, we haven't got around to that yet. I don't know if anybody else has, so none of our neighbours have come and said, let's fill this in.
Yes.
And yet that's one where there's a communal interest.
That's right. That could well be a catalyst for better contact. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, this had better be our last question. I think we're out of time. Thank you.
Speaking about this, it feels like
Sorry, can you just speak up a bit?
it feels like the environments that we're living in, like such as the neighborhoods, schools that our children go through, the workplace that we inhabit, are quite homogenous in some senses. That we live with people who are similar, and I feel like what it's saying that we should feel it's quite easy to extend compassion, inclusivity, and cohesion to people who we see as similar. And I feel maybe could you speak about how we might extend that to people who we see to be dissimilar to ourselves, even though, like for example, people in the same social category, we might see them in the same neighborhood, but we don't extend our compassion to those.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, look, there's absolutely no virtue in being nice to people we like. And there's absolutely no virtue in being nice to our friends or people who are like us. I mean, it's terrific. When I say there's no virtue in it, I don't mean it's a bad thing. I mean, there's no particular virtue in that because we like them. They're our family, they're our friends, sure. The virtue is when we do exactly as you've suggested, when we extend the compassion to people who are clearly unlike us. Now, it is true in many places with streets where people live, where, like Les, they put each other's bins out and all that sort of stuff. It may be quite a homogeneous community. But more and more around Australia, communities are becoming more heterogeneous. And that is, of course, very good for us. The people who are railing against increasing diversity, I heard read a Murdoch columnist writing about how diversity is the weaponization of political correctness and it's going to kill us all. Well, exactly the opposite. Diversity is the making of us because that's when we are forced to appreciate that compassion doesn't stop at the front gate or in the local faith community or with my friendship circle or my book club. Compassion is the fuel that is required to drive the machinery of social inclusion. And so the real test of whether we've got it, of whether we've made that, what I described as a rational response to an understanding of what it means to be human, the test of whether we've made that response is whether we can jump the fence of diversity and extend compassion to people we don't know and who appear to be very different from us, but who nevertheless, it turns out, are human. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh, on behalf of everyone in the audience tonight for coming to discuss such interesting and topical matters. I know I'll be thinking about it tonight. As a token of our appreciation, we have a gift for you from the college, which is, I might leave it until the end. And that does conclude the formalities for this evening. But I do invite you to tea and coffee and hot chocolate, as I understand it, as well. And gentlemen's bathrooms that way, ladies' bathrooms that way if you need it. But thank you very much for coming.